Punishment by Proxy by James Connely. Tina Mason gazed out of the small oval window of the twin-engined executive jet at the blue shimmering waters of the Persian Gulf far below. They were nearing the end of their journey, but she could still scarcely believe her good fortune at getting in on a trip such as this. That she had was due to her brother, Bob, who sat beside her in the aircraft. He held an executive post with one of Britain's biggest oil companies, and when he came home one day and announced that he was going to the Persian Gulf on business for a week, Tina was full of envy. "How about taking me along?" she had suggested in fun. She was home on holiday before her final term at technical college, and rather at a loose end. To her surprise, Bob did not brush off the remark as a joke. "As a matter of fact, I was thinking about that," he replied. "I'm entitled to a first-class airfare, so I thought if I travelled tourist, the difference would pay for most of your fare as well. What's more, when I mentioned this to Julius, who's going too, he thought it was a good idea and said he'd travel tourist as well. So we can more than cover your fare, and anything over will pay for your hotel." Bob had looked serious as he spoke, but there was a twinkle in his eye as he added, "I warn you, it'll be darned hot at this time of the year, but you can come if you want to." If she wanted to? What a question. Tina did not have to think twice. She simply threw herself round Bob's neck and hugged him. "Knock it off," he smiled, trying to break free of her embrace. Secretly, though, he was pleased with her response. He was 10 years older than Tina, but they had always been very close, even for a brother and sister, even now that she was 18, and had developed into a lovely young woman. In his eyes, she was still his little sister and in need of protection. Tina was still considering her good fortune when Julius Grant looked over his shoulder at them from the seat in front. "We should be there within half an hour," he announced. Grant was a man in his middle 40s, with thick, greying hair and a pencil-thin moustache. He held a senior position with the oil company and had been quick to spot Bob's potential when the young man had joined them nearly 8 years ago. He had taught Bob everything he knew about the business, and, in the years that followed, they had become a good team and close friends. "It was nice of the Sheikh to send one of his personal planes to meet us off the scheduled flight at Tehran," Tina said for the 4th time since they had taken off. She glanced about her at the lavish furnishings. "This is what I call real luxury." "Yes, whatever the outcome of our talks on the oil concessions, I don't think the Sheikh will ever be short of a square meal," Grant smiled wryly. "You know, Julius, I've been boning up on Sheikh Abdul al-Harid, all-powerful ruler of Bahrain," said Bob seriously. "Apparently he has the reputation of being something of a tyrant." "Why do you say that, Bob?" asked Tina. "Unfortunately, when a report comes out of a country like Bahrain, you can never be sure how accurate it is," Bob replied. Tina nudged him in the ribs. "Come on, don't hedge. What have you been reading?" "Nothing very specific, but I've seen a number of newspaper cuttings which suggested that the country isn't exactly a democratic welfare state. The Sheikh has his own small army, and apparently has the absolute power of life and death over his people." "There's nothing unique about that, Bob," Grant pointed out. "I could name half a dozen such states in the Middle East, maybe a dozen, where they have the same setup." "Yes, I know, but I've also read the occasional outbreaks of unrest in Bahrain have been put down with exceptional severity," Bob insisted. "That is a euphemistic way of saying with unnecessary cruelty. It would seem that our Sheikh, or at least some of his men, has an unusually nasty streak." "As you say, Bob," Grant reminded him, "it depends who writes these things. But name me any of the great powers who haven't been subjected to similar accusations, even in recent years, never mind a small Arab sheikhdom. What about Russia, in Hungary and Czechoslovakia? China, in Tibet, America, in Vietnam or the French in Algiers. Even the British in Cyprus came in for similar attack, so I don't think we should be too critical of our friend, harried on the evidence of a few newspaper cuttings. Perhaps you're right, Julius, Bob agreed reluctantly. But it seems to me that when these things happen in one's own country, it is even more reprehensible. It somehow smacks of feudalism and the Middle Ages. If they happen, Grant repeated. Anyway, it's none of our business how Karain is governed. Our job is to talk them into renewing the oil concessions at the most favourable terms. And I still say it was thoughtful of him to send one of his own private aeroplanes to meet us, said Tina for the 5th time. Yes, and if you had ever experienced this trip in an old Dakota, with no pressurization or air conditioning, you would appreciate it even more, Grant assured them. I'll bet the Dakota didn't have one of these either, Bob smiled. He was referring to the attractive coloured girl who had looked after them and plied them with food and drinks throughout the journey. Now she was approaching from the front of the aircraft, her white teeth gleaming in the same broad smile which she had worn ever since she welcomed them aboard at Karain. We will be landing at Karain in a few minutes, she announced. Would you please fasten your safety belts? Karain is situated halfway down the Persian Gulf. It is a tiny sheikhdom, extending about 20 miles into the huge landmass of Saudi Arabia, and with no more than 10 miles of coastline. It is also, however, one of the richest 200 square miles of land on Earth, with unlimited deposits of oil beneath its sun-parched sand. The small airport is situated to the west of the capital, which is also called Karain, and where nearly 4/5 of the state's entire population live. A black Mercedes met the 3 travellers off the aircraft and drove them straight to the Sheikh's palace, without any explanation from the driver. Within half an hour of landing, therefore, they were swinging in through heavily guarded gates and approaching the huge white building, which held a unique position on top of a hill overlooking the grey, dusty city on 3 sides and the cool waters of the Gulf on the 4th. Alighting from the car, they were met at the massive porticoed entrance by a man in flowing white robes and traditional kafiyeh headdress. As they approached, he bowed low. I am Hassan, personal assistant to Sheikh Abdul Al-Harid. Welcome to Karain, he said in a deep, solemn voice. There was no hint of a smile on his bearded face as he shook hands with the 2 men. Then, turning to Tina, he asked, And who is this lovely young lady? May I introduce my sister Tina, said Bob. Welcome, Miss Tina. Hassan took her hand gently and bowed low again, before looking closely into her face for several seconds with his dark, hypnotic eyes. Thank you, Tina smiled shyly. Actually, I only came for the ride. I am hoping to see something of your country while Bob and Mr. Grant are working. In that case, I trust you will enjoy your visit. Hassan addressed the 3 of them. It is at the Sheikh's wish that you stay at the palace while you are in Karain. But I am only on holiday, Tina protested. I couldn't possibly. The Sheikh would be most offended if you were to refuse his hospitality, Hassan interrupted her, and continued as if the matter was settled. Now if you will follow me, I will show you to your quarters. Please do not worry about your luggage. It will arrive there before you. The cool, lofty interior of the palace reminded Tina of a cathedral. Their footsteps rang out loudly on the polished marble floor as they passed along grey echoing corridors which linked an endless succession of huge empty chambers. Vaulted ceilings of intricate mosaic tilework formed a colourful series of canopies high above their heads, and priceless tapestries and paintings adorned the walls on all sides. Their spacious quarters were furnished with a lavish splendour which would have made even the most expensive hotel in the Western world seem drab by comparison. It provoked Bob to comment, when they were there alone and had gathered in his apartment a little later, "If these are the visitors' quarters, I wonder how the Sheikh lives." "Yes, and in spite of your doubts about our host, I don't think he's given us much cause to question his hospitality so far," Grant pointed out. "I'm forced to agree with you there," Bob acknowledged. "The thing that's bothering me," said Tina, "is what do I wear when we meet him?" She hugged herself happily. "Fancy him saying that I was to come along as well when you two are introduced to him. Wait till I tell the girls back at the college." "I expect, like most men, he enjoys meeting a pretty girl," Grant suggested. "Come off it, Julius," said Bob. "If he's anything like the sheikhs one reads about, he'll have more girls at his beck and call than he knows what to do with." "In that case, perhaps he'll put some of them at our disposal while we're here," Grant smiled. "Honestly, you men," Tina protested. "Remember, you're here on business. I'm the one who is supposed to enjoy herself." Sheikh Abdul al-Harid was a short, fat little man, with a dark pointed beard and close-set eyes. The intensity of his gaze made Tina slightly uncomfortable when she was introduced to him, and, not knowing the etiquette for such an occasion, she curtsied when he took her hand and placed it to his lips. "This is indeed an unexpected pleasure, Miss Mason," he said with the same solemnity that Hassan had shown earlier. And then to Bob, "You have a very beautiful sister, Mr. Mason." He gave a little smile as he added, "I know a lot of tribal chieftains not too far from here who would give many goats in exchange for her. I take it, though, that she would not be for sale." "I think, sir, that our parents would have something to say to me if I were to return home with a plain load of goats instead of Tina," Bob replied with a broad grin. Harid became serious again. "Yes, I'm afraid the customs of the East and West are still centuries apart, and in spite of modern communication, the two really know nothing of each other. Here in Karain, we try to take advantage of 20th century progress, while retaining the best of our old customs and traditions." He looked at the three of them in turn. "Apart from Allah, of course, the most sacred of all our traditions is hospitality to an invited guest, and I hope there will be time, while you are here, to demonstrate what I mean." "We have already had ample evidence of your generosity and hospitality, sir," Grant assured him. "Good, good," Harid approved. "And now I hope you will excuse me. Tomorrow morning, before you begin your discussions, gentlemen, I would like to show you some of the most interesting parts of my humble palace." He looked apologetically at Tina. "I regret, Miss Tina, that you will be unable to accompany us, as custom decrees that much of the palace is forbidden to women." He smiled. "You see, female emancipation has not reached the stage that it has in your country. In fact, I doubt if it ever will. However, I would be honoured if you would come to the dinner which I will be giving in honour of your visit the day after tomorrow. In the meantime, I will put a car at your disposal, and please feel free to come and go in our small country as you wish. Now I bid you good day." The audience had ended. The following morning, Tina set off to tour the capital, while Grant and her brother renewed their acquaintance with Sheikh Harid. Much to their surprise, he insisted on conducting them personally around the palace, with Hassan close on their heels and palace guards trailing a discreet distance behind. The palace was a treasure house of art and antiques, and the Sheikh was the perfect guide, with a remarkable knowledge of their history. After nearly an hour, they took a concealed lift to the giant dome which towered above all else in Karain, and from the balcony which encircled it, they looked down at the teeming life of the city far below. At that height, the morning air felt relatively cool on their perspiring faces, and to the two Englishmen it was as if they had stepped into an Eastern fairy tale. "If you have seen all you wish to up here," the Sheikh announced at last, "I will now show you what few Western eyes have ever seen." They took the lift back to ground level and, leaving the palace, walked out into the extensive grounds at the rear. Part of these, near the palace itself, was sectioned off by a high, shrub-covered wall of local stone, and the only access to whatever lay behind the wall was through massive iron gates, which appeared to be even more heavily guarded than the palace entrance. These were drawn open as they approached, and they passed through into a beautiful landscaped garden beyond. "This, gentlemen, is my garden of pets," the Sheikh announced, when they were inside, and the gates had shut behind them. The two Englishmen just stood and gaped in astonishment at the sight which met them. It was not the exotic flowers and plants, blooming with unnatural splendour, that made them speechless, however, nor the mosaic-tiled pools of crystal-clear water into which cool, tinkling fountains sprayed endlessly. Nor was it the many acacias and tall white-barked chinar trees which sheltered the garden from the sun's torrid rays, transforming it into a green, shady oasis. It was the 20 or more girls who strolled or swam, or just lay, sunning themselves in this paradise. All of them were young and beautiful, but the most surprising thing of all was that every one of them was completely naked. "I can see from your faces that your initial reaction is favourable," the Sheikh observed. "Let us walk round." As they sauntered through the garden, each girl in turn stood stiffly to attention when they approached, and then after they had passed, continued with whatever she had been doing. To the newcomers it was like inspecting a heavenly guard of honour, and they gazed with a mixture of desire and admiration at each bare female body. "It is strange," said the Sheikh with a knowing smile, when they stopped in the centre of the garden, "but all my guests go completely silent when I bring them through here, as though they had lost the power of speech." Bob found his tongue at last. "I think we are surprised and delighted that you should allow us to look at such beauty, sir," he admitted. The Sheikh shrugged indifferently. "Please do not make the wrong assumption. This is not my harem. That is in another part of the palace, where no one but myself and my special guards are allowed, and they would certainly not be permitted to appear unclothed, like these young females. No, gentlemen, these are my prisoners." "Your prisoners?" echoed his guests in astonished unison. "That's right, they are all here because of some misdemeanour against either myself or the state." Harid spread his hands. "But how am I to judge them? Although I am their ruler, I am only human, and so I leave it to Allah to decree their fate. While He decides, however, I try to make their captivity as pleasant as possible, within certain limits of confinement." The Sheikh looked again at the two men and smiled strangely. "Before we go, there is just one more thing. You may each choose a girl to share your bed with you tonight." "Any of them?" asked Bob, unable to believe his good fortune. "Any one," he was assured, "and perhaps you would like to choose first, Mr. Mason." Any of the girls would have attracted a man's attention, with or without clothes, but Bob was in doubt. Walking round, he had spotted a dusky-skinned beauty, who had been swimming in one of the pools when they entered the garden. She had quickly climbed out as they passed and stood erect, with tiny droplets of water streaming down her young athletic body. She could not have been more than 17 or 18, but she was fully developed and a superb specimen. Even in such company she was head and shoulders above the others in Bob's eyes. "All the girls are lovely, but my choice would be that dark one over there by the pool, sir," he said without hesitation. When she was led over to them, she stood staring straight ahead with her arms at her sides, and as still as if she had been carved from mahogany. Then at a signal from Hassan, she walked up and down before them, so that they could examine her from every angle. The rear view was equally alluring, and the sensuous way her plump round bottom swayed with every step made Bob wonder if she was deliberately trying to excite them. "You have a good eye for a woman, Mr. Mason," the sheikh said approvingly at last, while his hand strayed intimately over her coffee-coloured skin. "She is a fine choice, and tonight she will be yours, but there is just one more thing I would like to know. Which part of her body do you find most attractive?" "She looks perfect all over to me," Bob admitted. "But surely there's a part you particularly like," the sheikh insisted. "Well, with the accent very much on short skirts in our country, I am bound to say that she has the most magnificent legs I have ever seen," Bob replied. "Excellent," Hareed applauded. "And now, Mr. Grant, would you also like to choose a companion for your bed tonight?" Tina was full of her day spent touring the capital, but when she tried to relate her adventures to her companions that evening, she was disappointed to find that the two men were only half listening to her. "I don't believe you've heard one word I've said, Bob," she complained impatiently at last. "I thought you'd want to know what I've been doing all day, but you don't seem a bit interested. And you're as bad, Julius." "Sorry, Tina," Bob apologized. He looked meaningfully across at Grant. "I'm afraid we've had rather a heavy day. In fact, if you don't mind, I think I'll turn in." "I think I'll do the same, if you'll excuse me, Tina," Grant added quickly. "What's wrong with you two?" she protested. "It's still early, and I was hoping you were going to take me out and show me the Karanian nightlife." "Please, not tonight, Tina. I really am whacked," Bob pleaded. "I don't think I've got fully acclimatized yet. It must be the heat." He kissed his sister lightly on the cheek and left her, very conscious of the indignant gaze which followed him out of the door. Grant waited a few minutes longer before making his apologies and retiring as well. "Honestly," she grumbled, when she was alone, "we come all this way and all they want to do is go to bed. I just don't understand it." Bob was in his room only a few minutes when the girl arrived. He had been beginning to wonder if the events in the garden that morning had really happened, or whether they were just a lovely dream. She was a lovely dream, all right, but she was very real. Dressed in a wispy blue silk shift that hung in loose folds to her feet, she looked even more beautiful than he had remembered her from the morning. Before he could speak, she reached for the clip which fastened the shift at her throat, and, with a whisper, it slid from her body to lie in a pool of blue round her feet. Beneath it, she was as naked as when he had first seen her. "I have been told to make you happy," she said simply, in broken English. The blood throbbed heavily in Bob's veins. "You are the most lovely creature I have ever seen," he said softly, taking her hands in his and gazing almost reverently at her nude body. "It makes me very happy just to look at you." She slipped her hands gently out of his and moved into the encircling embrace of his arms. Placing her arms round his neck, she drew his face down and their lips met. Any lingering feelings Bob might have had that it would be wrong to take this girl because she was being forced to come to him vanished at that moment. The effect of her physical presence overcame any moral scruples he might have held up until then, and, besides, she appeared to be as eager as he was. They made violent, passionate love, with an intensity and mutual understanding that transcended mere animal attraction. The girl's sexual awareness equalled the exceptional beauty of her velvet-skinned body, and when they paused to rest at last, Bob felt that he had discovered the ultimate pleasures of true physical love. As they lay in each other's arms, her long shapely limbs entwined with his, they talked. She told him that her name was Aisha, and she lived all her life in Karain, learning English from her father. When he whispered in her ear that he loved her, however, he felt her stiffen against him. Drawing back to look into her face, he saw that her big dark eyes mirrored an infinite sadness tinged with fear. "You must not say that, Bobby," she told him. "Why not?" he asked. "Even though we have just met, I still know that I am in love with you. I am a prisoner of Sheikh Harid, and will never see you again after tonight," she explained sadly. "But what have you done?" She shrugged. "I did nothing, but my father owns a newspaper in Karain, and he printed things which the Sheikh regarded as critical of his person. I don't see what that has to do with you. You do not know the Sheikh. He is a cruel man, and takes his revenge in strange ways, where it hurts most. You see, my father is old, and there is little they can do to him. At the very worst they could kill him, but already he is a sick man, and may soon die anyway. So by punishing me, he is made to suffer much more. Most of the girls you saw today are innocent, but they were brought to the palace because one of their friends or relatives has broken the law." "But what will happen to you now?" asked Bob. "None of us knows for sure," Aisha replied. "But we have heard terrible rumours which I dare not even repeat. All we are certain of is that no girl remains here longer than a year. Also, when one of us is chosen to spend the night with a guest of the Sheikh's, she never returns to the garden." "I must and will see you again," said Bob fiercely. "And please don't be sad or frightened any more. Everything will turn out all right, I promise you." They made love several more times that night, and Bob finally fell asleep with his head cushioned on the girl's breasts, and the wonderful musky scent of her body in his nostrils. When he awoke in the morning, she had gone. "It doesn't look as if the early night did you too much good. You both look awful," Tina said candidly when she saw Bob and Grant at breakfast. The two men glanced at each other, but made no comment until they were alone. "Have you got fully acclimatized yet?" asked Grant. "If appearances are anything to go by, I take it you had a good night." "Unbelievable. And how about you?" "Me too," Grant smiled wanly. "But I'm not looking forward to a day of hard bargaining with our Karanian friends. Anyway, come on, let's get on with it." The negotiations were protracted and inconclusive. Snags were reached at an early stage, and the way the Karanian delegation dug their heels in on relatively minor points suggested to the Englishmen that they did not want to arrive at an early agreement over the oil concessions. "I reckon they've got someone else on the hook as well," said Grant at the end of a dispiriting day, when they were back in their apartment. "Could be," Bob argued. "Anyway, we know how far we're prepared to go, so if they won't come to terms before that stage, I suppose we'll have to reconsider our whole position and contact London." He had found it a particularly trying day. On an occasion like this, when he needed to harness all his knowledge and concentration to help his senior colleague with the negotiations, he had been unable to put Aisha out of his mind. The memory of the previous night, in all its wonderful vivid detail, kept crowding in on his mind, and he wondered guiltily if he had done his best for his company. It even crossed his mind that presenting girls to Grant and himself for the night might have been a ploy on the part of the Karanians to soften up their business opponents before the talks began. Surely, though, this was too devious, even for these strange, impassive people. In any case, his feelings for the girl remained unchanged. He had to see her again, no matter what the cost. It was with this unsettled feeling of frustrated preoccupation that Bob accompanied Tina and Grant that evening to the dinner which the Sheikh was giving in their honour. Apart from Harid himself, the dinner party included one of his favourite wives and 2 of his sons. They were slimmer versions of their father, but not yet capable of growing a respectable beard between them, although one of them was obviously trying hard. Several ministers and other important officials were also present, including 2 who had taken part in the talks during the day. Hovering on the edge of the party as well was the faithful, ever-present Hassan. The Sheikh was a cheerfully attentive, if somewhat dominant host. When he talked, everyone listened, and he talked incessantly. Nevertheless, with young scantily clad girls serving the food on large silver platters, and a small orchestra providing a background of shrill Eastern music, the traditional Oriental atmosphere was firmly established. The food itself was quite sumptuous, and though many of the dishes were foreign to a Western palate, Tina recognised the caviar, though she was tasting it for the first time in her life. She was not impressed. The skewered sturgeon was much more to her liking, and so was the heavily garnished chicken kebab, and the assortment of citrus and other fruits, which adorned the tables in juicy clusters of rich colour. A succession of local and far-travelled wines accompanied each course, and clearly no effort had been spared to make the meal a memorable one. Yet Bob worked his way through it without enthusiasm. "You have been very quiet this evening, Mr. Mason," remarked Hassan, who had been sitting beside him. Bob made up his mind there and then to unburden himself. "Perhaps you can help me, Hassan. Do you remember that girl I chose in the garden yesterday? Of course, she was very beautiful, but then Sheikh Harid only keeps beautiful girls in his garden of pets." Hassan replied, "I trust she was to your liking." "Very much so," Bob said seriously. "In fact, I want to see her again. Do you think you could arrange it for me with the Sheikh?" For the first time since they met, Bob noted the suspicion of a smile on the face of the Sheikh's personal aide. It was not a friendly smile, though, but more a curl of the lips. "I am afraid that would be quite impossible," he assured Bob. "You have already enjoyed the girl as no man will ever enjoy her again. That is how Allah wished it, and with that you must be satisfied. There is nothing I, or even Sheikh Harid, could do for you, even if we wished to." Hassan turned away, and the conversation was obviously closed as far as he was concerned. Bob was far from satisfied, however, and much later, when the dinner was over and he was back in his apartment, Hassan's words went through his mind over and over again. They left him strangely disturbed, but even more determined to see the girl again. At last he made his mind up, and, on soft rubber soles, he left his room and crept down a back stairway to the ground floor of the palace. It was getting late, and the lights had been dimmed in the great silent chambers and corridors. Keeping to the shadows, he glided towards the rear of the massive building, only stopping to get his bearings or to dodge for cover when any unsuspecting servant or guard came his way. He found the door which led out to the grounds and followed the inside wall, coming finally to a more enclosed part of the palace. Here the corridors were narrower, and long lines of closed doors, as in a hotel, were in marked contrast to the wide open spaces of the rest of the palace which he had known up until now. It was like searching for the proverbial needle, but he was determined, Anything was better than the yearning uncertainty which had gnawed at his thoughts all day. He tried each of the doors in turn. Some were locked, while others gave access to empty bedrooms. Then, as he approached the end of one of the corridors and had almost given up hope, he heard a low moan close at hand. It came from behind the very last door, which opened when he tried the handle. A clinical antiseptic smell met him as he slipped inside, closing the door behind him. The room was in semi-darkness, but he could still make out the low couch against the far wall. Another soft moan came from it, much louder now that he was inside the room and moving towards the couch. His heart leapt when he saw who lay there. It was Aisha. Her eyes were closed and, as he put his face down to hers, another little moan escaped her lips. "Aisha," he whispered, placing his hand gently on her feverish brow. "It's me, Bob. I said I would see you again." The girl's eyes opened and stared unseeingly for a few moments before focusing on his face. "Bobby," she whispered through parched lips. "Oh, Bobby, why did you have to come?" She appeared to have been heavily sedated, and her eyes kept flickering, as if the lids were too heavy for her to keep open. "I had to see you again," he repeated. "But what's the matter? Are you in pain?" He sank to his knees beside the couch and held one of her small hot hands in his. As his other hand rested lightly on the blanket over her thigh, however, an icy finger of horror ruffled the nerves at the nape of his neck. Then it sped down his spine when he drew back and looked down at the length of her. The bulge made by her body under the blanket ended halfway down the couch. He flicked back the bedclothes so that his eyes could confirm the ghastly evidence of his hand. The girl was still naked, but it was not her sun-kissed shoulders or golden breasts that held his gaze. Instead, he stared unbelievingly at the white bandages which swathed her hips. Below these there was nothing. Her legs had been amputated high up at the hip bone. "Oh my God!" he breathed. She opened her eyes again and tried to raise her head. Even in her drugged state, she knew that he knew. "I did not want you to see me like this, Bobby," she murmured weakly. "They took off my legs to punish my father." Her head sank wearily back onto the pillow, and Bob gently drew the blanket back over her mutilated body. He knelt for several minutes looking down at her lovely features, now composed in merciful sleep, before finally rising to his feet, and tiptoeing out of the room, closing the door behind him. His heart was sick with disgust and despair, but overriding all his other feelings was an intense anger and hatred for the people who could have done such a thing to an innocent girl. He stumbled blindly through the silent building, and, though he no longer made any attempt to move unseen, no one crossed his path. Somehow he found his way back to Grant's apartment and hammered on the door until his friend let him in. In a few garbled sentences he explained what he had just seen. "How could anyone do such a thing?" he sobbed. "I told you there was something wrong with this country before we even got here." Grant tried to console him, but he too felt sickened and even a little frightened by what Bob had told him. "Tina!" Bob gasped suddenly. "We must get her out of here. There's no telling what these swine might do if they have the notion." In spite of his friend's assurances that nothing could possibly happen to his sister, a British subject, Bob insisted that she must leave at once, and so in the end Grant agreed. When she was awakened and told to pack, Tina protested bitterly at first, especially since neither her brother nor Grant would give her an explanation. The haunted look on Bob's face, however, convinced her that something serious had happened, and so she finally obeyed. In a matter of minutes, she was gliding down the stairs and out of the palace between the two men who carried her luggage. They reached the car, which had been put at her disposal by the sheikh, without meeting anyone, and Bob almost pushed her behind the wheel. "Look, Tina," he said to her through the window. "If you drive north up the coast road, you will reach the Karanian border after about 6 or 7 miles. On the other side is Bazira. The capital, Inam, is only about 10 miles farther on. So you'll be there in less than an hour. Go straight to the British consulate and stay there till you hear from us. We'll be in touch within the next day or two." "But what are you going to do?" she protested. "And what will the Karanians say when they discover that I've gone?" "More to the point is what will I say to them," Bob replied fiercely. "Anyway, I don't want you to be around to get any of the backlash, so off you go and don't stop for anything." The car roared into life, and the reluctant Tina drove out through the palace gates and out of their sight. The two men walked slowly back into the palace, each deeply engrossed in his own thoughts. "What are you going to tell Harrod about Tina?" asked Grant, when they had reached his apartment and were discussing the situation over a drink. "Remember, we've still a lot of negotiating to do over those oil concessions." "To hell with the oil concessions!" Bob snapped vehemently. "I'm thinking about that poor girl down there whose life has been completely ruined for nothing. What about her?" He glanced at his watch and felt a wave of relief. It was half an hour since Tina had left, and she would be over the border by now and completely out of danger, real or imaginary. "I'm going down again to see Aisha," he announced. "Are you coming with me, Julius?" Knowing that nothing he could say would dissuade his young friend, Grant agreed to accompany him, and so, once more, they groped their way through the dimly lit building. It was easier this time, since Bob knew the way, and they duly arrived at the door of the room where Aisha lay. They were surprised to find it ajar, but when they pushed it open and looked inside, they saw why. Hassan was standing by the couch, contemplating the still form of the girl, and 2 armed guards stood behind him, with their backs to the door. "You brutes!" Bob spat at them. "Why did you do it?" Hassan and the guards whirled round, but relaxed when they saw who it was. "You should not be here," warned Hassan. "How did you find this room?" "Is that all you've got to say?" Bob screamed at him. "Look what you've done." He pointed to the girl on the couch. "You have exceeded your position as guests of Sheikh Harid," Hassan said coldly. "That is most regrettable. Now you will return to your rooms at once." Bob stood his ground. "Not until you explain this atrocity," he gritted through thin hard lips. "I am not obliged to explain anything to you, but since you insist, I will," Hassan said coldly. "Then you must go. This girl's father wrote traitorous words against the person of Sheikh Harid, and so to punish him, and make him and others think before they do such a thing again, his daughter was arrested." "But why this?" asked Grant. "It was Allah's wish," Hassan replied simply. "The Sheikh is a humble man, and in such matters he does not feel that he alone can prescribe a suitable punishment. Therefore he lets Allah decide. This girl and others whose families or friends have committed crimes are kept in his garden of pets. Many of them are set free after a year, quite unharmed, but those chosen by Sheikh Harid's guests during that year are dealt with. Having made his choice of a bed partner, each guest is asked which parts of the girl's body he likes most. Those parts are then surgically removed after she has spent the night with that guest. When the girl has recovered sufficiently, she is returned to her home, as a living example of Allah's judgment. He went on, "You, Mr. Mason, chose this girl, not Sheikh Harid. You spoke of her fine legs, and so it was you, as the mouthpiece of Allah, who decreed her fate." "You cruel bastards!" Bob shouted, unable to contain himself any longer. "You play these monstrous games with young girls' lives for your amusement and then blame it on your God. You'll pay for this." Hassan actually smiled, a cruel, mocking smile, which served only to inflame Bob's fury. "The Sheikh will be made aware of your accusations, and they will not improve your chances of gaining the oil concessions for your company," he sneered. "I know you Western capitalists. When it becomes a matter of money and profit, you swallow your pride quickly enough. However, if you make a full apology to me now for your rash words, I may be persuaded not to let it go any farther." The man's arrogance and complete indifference were the final straws as far as Bob was concerned. His sorely tried restraint snapped, and, with a roar of anger, he leapt at one of the unsuspecting guards and hauled his revolver from its holster. Before he could raise it, though, Hassan closed on him, and the two men grappled for possession of the gun. Suddenly there was a shot, and the expression on the Karanian's face turned to surprise and then pain, as he sank slowly to the floor and lay still. "Now you've done it," said Grant. "I didn't mean to shoot him, but the rat deserved it anyway," said Bob, keeping the two guards covered. Although he had regained control of himself, he felt no regrets. "I only wish it had been his master." "We've got to get out of here," Grant insisted. "What about Aisha? We won't be able to help her if we get caught. Come on, we've no time to argue." Bob saw the sense of his friend's words, and the two of them backed out of the door, locking it on the outside before racing down the corridor. Shouts and the sound of many running feet were gathering momentum as they found an outside door which led out to the palace gardens. A breathless gallop across the open ground brought them to the high perimeter wall, which they scaled with an agility shared only by wild beasts and hunted men. Keeping to the shadows, they raced through narrow streets, heading downhill towards the harbour. Once they had got clear of the palace, however, they heard no sound of pursuit, and reached the water without difficulty. "Our best way out of here is by sea," gasped Grant, looking over the long lines of small craft that bobbed under a full moon. Bob nodded in agreement, and they selected a small sailing dinghy. When they cast off, a light offshore breeze filled the single white wedge of sail, and pushed them silently out into the bay and the open gulf beyond. Their escape had been incredibly easy, or lucky, and soon they were well clear of land, and able to look back at the many pinpricks of light, which were all that remained for them of Karain. Perhaps they imagined it, but they both thought they could see brighter moving lights up on the hill above the town, where the palace stood. The few distant sounds that reached them from the shore gradually receded, and they were left in a vacuum of smooth, moon-drenched sea. Their objective was to sail northwards, up the coast, until Karain had been left behind, and then they hoped to be able to go ashore in safety. The Shamal had other ideas, however, and this local prevailing northwest wind drove them south during the night and out of sight of land. A day and a night later they were picked up, parched, burnt, and exhausted, by a Panamanian tanker and taken to Abadan. By the time they reached Bazira, 3 whole days had elapsed. They went straight to the British consulate building, only to find that Tina had never arrived there. Tina never even got out of Karain on the night she left her 2 anxious companions. She cleared the city without difficulty, but about 4 miles farther on, The steering got heavy and the car started to pull to one side. An ominous bumping sound confirmed that she had picked up a puncture, and having no idea how to change the wheel, she sat disconsolately for the next half hour, before an increasing glow in the night sky heralded the approach of another vehicle. When she flagged it down, it turned out to be a police car, and 2 policemen climbed from it. They walked round her car, eyeing it suspiciously, before one of them returned to his car and put out a radio call. When he returned, he told Tina that she was to accompany them back to the city and, despite her protests, she was bundled into their car. When she had been returned to the palace, she was locked in a bare, uncomfortable room, far removed from the luxury which she had enjoyed since her arrival in Karain. The next day was the most bewildering and frightening of Tina's young life. The Sheikh visited her in the morning, but displayed none of the friendliness of their previous meetings. He told her in harsh tones that her brother had committed a very serious crime, and if she wanted to help him, she must do exactly as she was told, without question. When he had left, Tina was made to strip completely, and was bathed and perfumed by palace servants. Still naked, she was then led out into a beautiful garden at the rear of the palace, and there, for the next 2 days, she was left in the company of another 20 or so girls, each of whom was as naked as herself. Late on the 2nd day, the Sheikh came into the garden, accompanied by 2 middle-aged men in white Western-styled suits, and followed by one of his personal servants. They walked slowly round, and each girl stood up straight and silent as they passed. Tina had been warned about the procedure, and stood, like the rest, feeling her face redden when they approached, and gazed for what seemed ages at her exposed charms. Worse was to follow when she was summoned across to them afterwards, and made to parade up and down, while they examined her body from every side. "I applaud your choice, Signor Romani," the Sheikh said approvingly at last, as he stroked Tina's soft, vibrant flesh. "And now tell me, which part of her lovely body do you find most attractive?" "Everything about her is quite beautiful," replied Harried's guest in halting English. "But above all, I think that she has the most exquisite breasts, and—" He paused. "Yes?" prompted the Sheikh. "And I also think she has wonderful blue eyes."